Hello guys, I've finally reached insane in-game status with my Whirlwind Barbarian. He's only level 83, I just crossed level 80 today, and he's finally able to easily annihilate content, can even delete the bosses at the end, especially while playing solo, and it's so easy with this build. This build is so incredibly powerful, and I finally got it to a point where I'm going to share it with you guys to show you the end game for the Whirlwind Barbarian, because even though it's not the Hoda Barbarian, it can still do an absolute insane amount of damage, and it has absolutely amazing clear times on all of these nightmare dungeons and in-game content. And set up this way, it has great survivability, so you won't be dying that much in-game, and in a way it almost makes you unkillable. I am going to go over the skill tree very quickly just in case anybody's not familiar with it, but this build in my opinion is the most fun to play, the most relaxing. It lets me chill back and, like I said, have a lot of fun. Let's go into the skill tree really quickly for people that are unfamiliar. So let's go over the skill tree again really fast for people that aren't familiar. Basic skills, you're going to want to take all three of these in the chain for lunging strike, so that way you can generate fury if you have to. All whirlwind all the way to furious whirlwind. You're then going to take the 3 out of 3 here for pressure point for vulnerable. You're then going to come down here and take 3 out of 3 for rallying cry and go over to tactical rallying cry for your main shout. You're then going to grab challenging shout and go to tactical challenging shout for that as well. You're then going to grab war cry down here for your brawling skills and go to power war cry. You're going to want to grab 3 out of 3 out of booming voice and 3 out of 3 for guttural yell. And one of the big changes is we're not going to put any points in raid leader because we really don't need it in this case, so I don't like putting points here. Instead, we end up putting those down here later, and we're going to go to aggressive resistance 1 out of 3 and then prolific fury 3 out of 3 for increasing fury generation while berserking. And then for our weapon mastery skills, we're going to grab 1 out of 3 for hamstring, giving us our slow effect on enemies, 3 out of 3 for pit fighter, and 3 out of 3 for no mercy, because no mercy gives us 9% increased critical strike chance to enemies that are slowed, etc., which they'll always be. This gives us an immediate 9% increase in critical strike. This is a much better skill in my opinion than raid leader and getting a little bit of healing, because we really don't need it with this build. And then in the ultimate skills category, we're going to take again Wrath of the Berserker all the way down to Supreme Wrath of the Berserker for a ton of damage. And then we're going to go with Tempered Fury 1 out of 3 and Invigorating Fury 3 out of 3, so that way we heal for 9% of our max life for each time we spend 100 Fury, which is basically every single second. So then we're going to grab Unbridled Rage, obviously for our key passive, because it gives us a ton of extra damage. And then 3 out of 3 for Heavy Handed, giving us 15% increased critical strike damage when using two-handed weapons. So that's kind of our build, and that's similar to the builds we've already done. Again, I got rid of Iron Skin just to go ahead and use Lunging Strike because it feels that much better. So I did swap that back out. And again, Raid Leader, make sure you have No Mercy instead, because of that critical strike chance you get is a really big deal. It gives you a lot more critical strikes that you're going to hit overall. Now we're going to go over the expertise again really quick. I haven't swapped this yet, so I'm still using a two-handed sword as my primary weapon for the bleeding, and then I'm using a two-handed axe expertise, so we get to take advantage of the 15% increased damage to vulnerable enemies. And right now this is the build I'm liking the most. It feels the most comfortable, so that's still what I'm doing there. Now for our Whirlwind Barbarian, I'm going to go over the aspects, because these are aspects that are more in-game, and I tailored them a little bit more with my gear to make this build much more survivable for in-game content and in-game tiers and nightmare dungeons, so that we have not only a bunch of damage but a lot more survivability, and we end up dying way less with all of this gear on the way I have it. So we're going to start with the helmet. So we're going to use this aspect that gives us barrier, absorbing up to a certain amount of damage for 10 seconds. Now this was a random find. You can imprint this from the Codex of Power, but generally I don't think it's going to give you that much barrier. So you want to look out for this kind of item that you're going to find, because if you find something with a big barrier on it like this, it procs again every 30 seconds, and it holds you a significant barrier compared to the portions of your health, and this is going to help you survive much longer. And the way this build works is we're going to stack Fortify and Barrier with this skill. And this aspect overall is going to help us survive a lot more fights very consistently. And essentially the difference between the time we start a fight with a big group of enemies and by the time we make it to the next group of enemies, it's going to be around 30 seconds. So this barrier should proc every single time you get into a big fight, makes you almost unkillable. And since you can roll a bunch of different stats on gear, everybody's is going to be pretty much a little different, but I'm going to go over the main stats for each piece that I think I'm enjoying with the build that I have. So one of the big things I think you want with a helmet that I focused on was max life. You can see my item power started at 778 for this helmet, but max life, having that, it gives me a 900 or almost 1,000 extra life, which takes me from about 5,000 to 6,000, and that 1,000 makes a big difference. 10% cooldown reduction, this is huge, and you should have it on every possible piece that you can get it on, especially for the Whirlwind Barbarian, because it's going to allow us to use our shouts infinitely over and over and over again. So if you get a piece for cooldown reduction, make sure you put it on, because with enough pieces of cooldown reduction added to this build, as well as some other pieces, you can have infinite uptime on your shouts. Total armor plus 8.3%. This is a fairly good roll and a big deal to have on a piece of armor. If you get this, do not re-roll it, do not trade it, because this is giving me, again, 8% additional total armor. That's a huge difference, which you can see my armor here is 7,000 compared to my attack, power, and life. It's making me able to sustain a lot more damage, making me a lot more powerful. Now, I already re-rolled this piece, so I have 19.5% damage while berserking, and this is still pretty good. This does go into the additive damage bucket, so I would prefer probably another stat here. Things to look for are damage reduction, so like damage reduction while fortified, big damage reduction stats like that. But if you find a damage reduction stat, ideally, I think that's what you would want here. So look out for damage reduction, because that's going to be one of the biggest pieces to endgame for protection. Next is I'm using the Rage of Haragoth unique ancestral chest. Now, some people are using different chests because of the min-maxing at the end of the game and damage reduction on those pieces, but right now, until you get to level 90 or 100, I just don't see the point in it. So you should stay with Rage of Haragoth unless you get a really good chest piece. This is giving us 14.2% physical damage, a huge damage boost, critical strike chance with physical damage against elites. For elites, that's a huge critical strike chance buff, meaning we're going to hit a lot more crits on elites. Damage reduction from enemies that are bleeding. Now, with this particular build being a bleeding build, all enemies are always going to be bleeding. That's a 16% damage reduction overall and holistically from every enemy. That is one amazing stat for this build, as well as the rest of armor pieces that you can get. So the more damage reduction you can get on all of the armor pieces, the better. Those are the ideal stats you want. And then 745 thorns is okay. I'm not using a thorns build, but I'll take it. And then obviously the biggest part to this piece is up to a 38% chance to reduce the cooldowns of your non-ultimate skills by 1.5 seconds when you inflict bleeding damage on elites. And this is going to work with our other pieces to allow it to reduce our cooldowns much quicker. And that's why this unique chest is basically best in slot for this build, unless you just find a godly roll on a chest piece with damage reduction on everything or physical damage on something like that. But this is definitely best in slot for almost every build, unless you find that great or perfect piece. Next are Gore's Devastating Grips. Now, if there's one specific unique item you could replace from this build, it would be this, but I'm still using it because I very much like it. The way it works, if you're not familiar, is Whirlwind explodes after it ends, so you can actually proc this while you're using it. I believe if you're using Whirlwind and you're currently in the middle of using it, you don't want to stop your rotations because you're building up that percentage damage essentially from Wrath of the Berserker. So while you're spinning, you're constantly building up damage. And what you can actually do is, if one of these skills are on a cooldown and you see it's not up or ready or off of its cooldown yet, you can actually hit the button to cast one of these skills, and it should proc that actual effect that's on your glove, so you don't have to stop spinning and lose out on that DPS or that damage. Now, again, it does explode and deal a lot of damage, so if you get an enemy 75% of the way down, essentially if you proc that ability or stop spinning, it will deal 26% of that original base damage and basically finish them off. Additionally, these specific gloves come with ranks to Whirlwind, which along a lot of other stats that this gear has is fairly hard to find just in terms of the number of ranks of Whirlwind you can get from this piece. And if you can see here with all of the damage multipliers that we currently have, one big thing here is I'm doing 11,600 to 14,200 damage per Whirlwind, basically as its main damage, and then it gets multiplied obviously by a bunch of other factors. Now again, having these gloves or gloves that have huge ranks to Whirlwind on them are very important, because if you see, I can take this off, and then when I go over here to my Whirlwind skill and look at it at 5 out of 5, it goes down to 9,500 to 11,000. You're missing out on 2,000 to 3,000 base damage at least per Whirlwind cast, which is like over 30% of your overall damage. So if you don't have +3 or +4 ranks of Whirlwind on your gloves, or you don't have these gloves yet, find some gloves and make sure you get it on your gloves, because you're missing out on like 30% of overall damage, probably at least, by not having that. And next we have what I finally found the other day are the Temerity pants. Now these are the other unique ancestral item, and again, there are better pants you can get with damage reduction. If you can find pants with full maxed out damage reduction on almost every slot, that gives you a ton of defensive ability. But unless you have that, this is very good, because it plays into the barrier aspect of the Whirlwind Barbarian. and it lets us do a bunch of more damage. And it gives us a ton of survivability, and it gives us a bunch of additional damage we can do due to that barrier. So again, effects that heal you beyond 100% life grant you a barrier of up to 48% to 80% of your maximum life. That lasts for 8 seconds. And the thing is, we're getting effects through this build automatically that are healing us beyond 100%, meaning you're going to proc, which means you're going to proc this effect very often and grant you that barrier of 48 to 80%. Now, my roll here is very low at 48%, but if you have a roll that's on the 70 to 80% side, you're going to get almost double what I'm getting in terms of barrier. And let me tell you, even with this very low roll, I'm getting amazing survivability, and I'm almost never dying in even these high tier level 40, 50, 60 dungeons. Next are the boots. Now there's a couple things I want to mention on the boots, that some things specifically we kind of give up. But first, I have the whirlwind aspect that periodically pulls enemies to you. Now some people use this and like it, some people don't. It doesn't give you any direct damage effects, but I just like it because it pulls all the enemies into a tight group, so I can hit every single person at once most of the time. Some people don't like this and want to trade this for damage or another aspect that's better, but I like this personally. It makes the game more fun for me. Now the big pieces on these boots are the 3 max evade charges, because as a barb you need to be able to use your max evade charges very often. Fury cost reduction, which is great again to have on any piece, so that way we're spending less fury, and we're reducing our cooldowns a lot faster with the other pieces of gear, so to make sure we almost never run out of fury because we're able to cast our shots consistently and generate that fury. And then we have strength, which is good. Willpower, which I am probably definitely going to re-roll, I just haven't done it yet. The best stat you can get on boots and other pieces of gear are movement speed, and this is because you can see I have the max roll of 26.2% movement speed, and if I had the other movement speed buff on these boots as well, it would be a game changer. It makes the game so much better. You have no idea how much better that actual stat and movement speed makes on your build until you have it. And then once you have it, you're speeding through these dungeons, speeding through enemies and everything, and you're able to cover twice the amount of ground in this game. So that's by far the best stat you can get on your boots is movement speed. And if you don't have it now, you need to make sure you have it. Next is my two-handed bludgeoning weapon, and I have the aspect here, but each point of fury you generate while at max fury grants your next core skill 3% increased damage up to 45% increased damage. Now ideally getting a max roll here could make this a really OP aspect, but we're constantly staying with our fury regeneration and cooldown reduction at close to max fury or at max fury all the time, and generating points while at max fury, meaning we're getting a huge damage boost here, and most of the time we're getting the 45% maximum damage boost. If you had 60% here, that's 60% maximum damage you could get as a bonus every single time you cast Whirlwind. As you can see, my affixes on this weapon are almost perfect. I have 180 strength. That's a huge deal, giving us a lot more damage overall because that's our main core stat. 57% critical strike damage, vulnerable damage plus 63%. That is a huge one, and that's giving us again a huge damage bonus to vulnerable enemies. And with this build we make enemies vulnerable at almost every second, so that's going to give us a huge benefit. And then 27% damage while berserking. Ideally you would want to probably re-roll that and get core skill damage if you could, but whether you use that skill or core skill damage, they're both in the additive buckets, but core skill damage is going to give you much more direct damage with your whirlwind and should scale with it, so go for core skill damage on that last weapon, and that's going to be the same affixes you want to focus on for the rest of your weapons. So the one-handed swords, the 2 aspects you need to have here are whenever you deal direct damage while berserking, inflict 25% of the base damage dealt as additional bleed damage over 5 seconds. And again, you can see my affixes here because I have both of them swords. They both have the permanent affix of critical strike damage at the top, which does apply to whatever weapon you're using. And vulnerable damage, core skill damage, strength, and all stats. That's perfect, except maybe the all stats you want to try and get crit strike damage with. And then additionally, the other aspect is skills that deal up to 10 to 20% increased damage based on your primary available resource, receiving the max benefit when you have full primary resource. And again, you can see the stats repeated here: crit strike damage, all stats, strength, vulnerable damage. And you want to make sure you're putting the max possible emeralds you can in these weapons, so that way you get the 12% critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies, because across all 4 of these weapons that we have, we get 24 for this one, 36, 48, and 72% additional critical strike damage for vulnerable enemies by having these max gems in our weapons. So you need to make sure you do that, because 72% is a huge difference in terms of damage. And then for our two-handed sword, we have the Whirlwind's critical strike chance is increased by 14% chance for each second as channeled. And that's obviously your main Whirlwind aspect, so you can put that on your two-handed bludgeoning weapon, so you don't have to change it out that much and just switch these around. But I just have it on my sword. And then you can see here I have all stats, strength, vulnerable damage, core skill damage, and again critical strike damage as an affix at the top. making this a very powerful weapon. Not perfect, but very, very powerful. And then our big jewelry pieces. For our necklace here, we have cooldown reduction on it, total armor for plus 8.7%, 14.4% damage at the bottom. That's a huge damage boost overall to our damage. And then 24% movement speed. So this pairs, and I chose to keep this amulet particularly because of the movement speed bonus that we have. So we have 26% here, 24% here, and then overall some other movement speed buffs from our shouts, etc. It allows us to run around very, very quickly, as you can see in some of the gameplay. So I highly recommend it. And then I have, as an aspect imprinted on it, the max roll for the armor aspect, which is going to give you 0.75% increased armor for 4 seconds when you do any form of damage. And this is going to stack and give us up to 75% consistent extra armor and basically almost double our armor value overall, making us a complete tank. Now generally this is 50% that it can go up to, but it's 75% because we put it on our amulet. You want to actually survive these dungeons, you need this aspect because we're going to be using Whirlwind around a ton of enemies obviously, and each one we hit we can almost instantly get that 75% max armor bonus, almost like I said, doubling our armor. So that is a big thing, and I have it on my amulet for the big boost that it gives it. And then for our 2 rings, we have vulnerable damage, damage to stun, close, and crowd controlled enemies, which isn't the greatest stat. I just haven't replaced this ring yet. And it makes your shout skills generate 2 to 4 fury per second while active. You have to have this ring in my opinion. It doesn't matter if the affixes on it are really bad, but this is a very important part to maintaining fury for your overall Whirlwind Barbarian. So that's one thing you definitely have to have, even if the ring isn't that good. Now finally, our last ring is the Bold Chieftain's ring, and it took me forever to find this. I finally found it at like level 80, and then once I found it at level 80, I found a second one at level 81, go figure. But this has made such a huge damage in my build, so if you haven't found this yet, keep looking for it because I promise you eventually you'll find it and you'll see it makes the world of difference. Now the second biggest thing to gear in these aspects and these stats and affixes is our Paragon board. So I'm going to go over the Paragon board, but I'm going to specifically show you from this view or this planner, so that way you can see the actual board names and see the stats that I take. So ideally this is the endgame board, and you want to start using this board after about level 70 or 75 because it gives you a huge damage boost overall and it gives you a lot more DPS. So first we're going to start out with the territorial board, and it should start out just like this. You're just going to trek your way up here and grab the territorial glyph first. And the big thing here is once it's maxed out, it's going to give us 77% damage to close enemies. And you also gain a 10% damage reduction to close enemies as well. So it's going to give us huge survivability because of the 10% damage reduction overall. And it's going to again give us a lot of damage to close enemies, which is great to start out because that's obviously a stat that we want added into that additive bucket. And again, you're just going to take the nodes shown on the screen, and these rare nodes will give physical damage and armor and strength. And once you meet the dexterity requirements and max out this glyph, you're going to get that overall big damage boost to close enemies. So that's good. And the second board we're going to want to go with is the Warbringer board. Now this board specifically is very important that you do this way, and I'll show you exactly why. So the first thing we're going to want to do is take this glyph. This glyph is the vulnerable glyph that you absolutely need for the Whirlwind Barbarian, so you have to make sure you have this before anything else. And as soon as you start this board, you need to make sure that you can make it all the way to this glyph and activate it before worrying about basically anything else. Now obviously this is going to be our most important glyph on the entire build because it's going to make any enemy damaged by you become vulnerable for 3 seconds, and this is obviously super important so that way they become vulnerable and we're able to do vulnerable damage to them with crit strike damage as well. It's going to amp our damage up tremendously because we do a tremendous amount of damage to vulnerable enemies overall. And additionally, once you level this glyph up, each 5 dexterity that you purchase within this range overall is going to give you a bonus 4% increased damage to vulnerable targets at max rank. So this will end up giving us a total of almost 40% extra vulnerable damage, which is a huge boost to our overall damage, and that 40% makes a huge difference. And then immediately after that, once you get that glyph activated, you want to go over here and grab these fury nodes and make your way over to this legendary node Warbringer. And this is a very important node because it makes it so each 75 fury you spend, which basically gets procced every like half a second because you spend fury like crazy, you gain 12% of your maximum life as fortify, and this allows us to stack fortify on top of all the other barrier effects that we already have with this build. And it just allows us to continue to stack fortify and barrier to the point nobody can even sometimes reach your actual health to be able to finish you off. So our third board is going to be the Decimator board with the Imbiber glyph in it. Now, the thing specifically you want to do here is if you can't get to board number 6 and max out that board yet, so the way this works is you're going to bring your Martial glyph in here. And this is, again, a huge part of this build, which is why you need it at slot number 3 if you can't complete them all, because it makes it so that after casting a shout skill, the active cooldown of every other shout skill is reduced by 1.2 seconds. It builds with all of the other effects and aspects and things that you have to reduce all the cooldowns for all your shouts to make them almost infinitely castable. Now, once you get this glyph here and activate it, you want to also make sure you grab this rare node that gives you plus 20% vulnerable damage when met. You want to make sure you grab this rare node, which is right on your way. It's giving you damage reduction from vulnerable enemies. And then you also want to make sure you grab this rare node in this particular sequence because of all the vulnerable damage buffs we get here, because it gives you an additional 20% vulnerable damage, which is, again, a huge bonus, and armor. So this is a very good node that you definitely want, but that's basically how your third board should look. Now, ideally for our fourth board, we should be using the Flawless Technique board using the Disembowel glyph. The Disembowel glyph is going to play perfectly into this build because it's going to make killing a bleeding enemy have a 10% chance to reduce the cooldowns of your non-ultimate active cooldowns by 1 second. And with how quickly we're able to run through enemies, we're going to use this again to just consistently beat down our cooldowns, so that way they just run infinitely as much as possible. And obviously these nodes right here are critical strike, physical damage. It gives you a huge DPS boost just between these 6 nodes. And then this one that gives you 15% critical strike and 10% physical damage. And then additionally these nodes up here giving you a ton of damage reduction overall, and then giving us another big boost to damage reduction from close enemies. So then you want to work over to your fifth board, the Bonebreaker node. We're going to use the Wrath glyph here, and the Wrath glyph makes it so that skills that critically strike generate 3% fury, so you're just getting additional fury generation again with this glyph in this board. And once we activate that, the big bonus that we get is for every 5 dexterity purchase within that range, your core skills deal 7.4% increased crit strike damage, which is basically like our main stat. So you can get, once this is leveled up all the way, over 70% critical strike damage additionally with your core skills. And this glyph alone, once you get to this point and max this glyph out with all of the surrounding nodes that you need, it's probably going to like double your damage just from these bonuses in general by themselves. So this is a very huge glyph to have additionally with these nodes down here. So just copy this as needed, because again, we get damage reduction overall and gives us a ton of defense down here on this node, similar to the last one. Once you get to board number 6 and are able to max this out, you can throw the Martial glyph back over here once you're able to max it out and activate it. And then once you're able to fill out board number 6, you're then just going to put the Martial glyph here, just like you can see with the following skills. And it's going to give you a decent amount of damage overall, as well as armor and strength, physical damage with a ton of damage bonuses. And then we're going to come back over here and respec this third board to the Imbiber glyph, which is going to give us 106% damage while healthy. Okay, and because we'll be fortified or have barrier almost all of the time with this build, this is going to give us a huge damage bonus almost all the time of 100% additional damage. The 30% increased potion healing is fine, whatever, but that damage bonus is insane. So once you get to board number 6, make sure you come over here and replace this glyph with Imbiber and put this on the Decimator board, and then put the Martial glyph on the Weapons Master board. And again, I'll just look over them really quick one more time. The starting board, Warbringer, Decimator here. Fourth board is Flawless Technique, Bonebreaker, and Weapons Master. So those are the ideal Paragon boards, and once you get those completely maxed out, even before that, once you get to about Paragon board number 3 or Paragon board number 4, you're going to see yourself doing way more damage than you even probably thought that you could do. It may take a little while to get specced out, but go out, set up your Barbarian similar to this, and I'm telling you, you will love it. Guys, if this video was helpful, make sure to drop a like on the video and check out one of these awesome Diablo 4 videos on the left or on the right of the screen. And let me know your thoughts on this build in the comments below. That being said, you guys have a good one. Thanks. Peace.